Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are cracking open a story that's thousands of years old, but we're filtering it through the really sharp, almost cynical lens of Margaret Atwood. And what we're trying to do is pull out the knowledge you need to understand why the myths of Penelope, the constant wife, might actually be one of the greatest betrayals in all of classical literature. We are deep diving into the Penelopiad.
It is an extraordinary journey, and our mission today is, well, it's pretty ambitious. We're not just summarizing the book. We're really analyzing Atwood's critical retelling of Homer's The Odyssey. We want to extract these key, really nuanced insights into who Penelope really was, the horrifying and, let's be honest, often overlooked controversy around the execution of those 12 hanged maids, and of course, the powerful revisionist view of Greek mythology that Atwood is offering us.
And to even start, you have to look at this massive, really uncomfortable gap in the original source material. You have to confront the glory and the gore right next to each other.
Exactly. On one hand, you've got Homer crafting this shimmering, epic tribute to Penelope. He crowns her the model of fidelity. In the final book of the Odyssey, we get this incredible description of the flawless Penelope, who is hailed for her preeminent virtue. She's a paragon whose story the gods themselves will make into a beautiful song. That's the ideal. That's the glory.
But the shadow that glory casts is the gore. Just a few pages earlier, in Book 22, our returning hero Odysseus and his son Telemachus, they commit this act of just casual brutality. And it's shocking how brief it is. 12 young women, the maids who worked and lived right there in the palace, are executed. The original text just says they take a ship's cable, tie it up high, and hang the women all in a row.
And the description of their death, that's what haunts Atwood, and I think it's what haunts any modern reader. It says, their feet twitched, but not for very long.
Oh, it's so clinical. It's this detached act of violence against women who had no power, and it's justified by this single vague accusation of disloyalty.
And that one scene, that one line, is Atwood's entire foundation. Her argument is that the official heroic version of the Odyssey just can't hold up under the weight of that one horrifying act. So she asks, why were those 12 girls killed? What did they actually know? And what was Penelope really doing for 20 years?
Right. Atwood's premise is basically that the official narrative is a lie, a cover-up designed to protect the hero, and someone else has to step in and tell the truth.
And to do that, she immediately subverts everything. She places a storyteller where she can finally speak without any fear of consequence. Penelope herself is narrating the whole story from Hades, from the underworld.
And she's not alone.
No, not at all. She has this permanent, rhythmic, and incredibly scathing backup vocal. It's the chanting, singing chorus of those 12 hanged maids. They're the constant, unavoidable evidence of the lie.
So let's start with Penelope's perspective from beyond the grave. She describes her state as bonelessness, liplessness, breastlessness, which is a pretty high price just to learn a few extra factoids she didn't know when she was alive.
Right. Her main complaint is that death was too high a price for curiosity. And you realize immediately that her death hasn't brought her some kind of ultimate wisdom. It's just given her a different perspective. She's still that same slightly cynical, slightly sarcastic person, but now she has the clarity of, the grave.
And she applies that clarity immediately to her husband. She brings up this central metaphor of the underworld, the sack of words.
Everyone arrives in Hades carrying a sack filled with words they've spoken, words they've heard, and crucially, words that were said about them.
And Penelope notes, with this really dry bitterness, that her sack is huge. And it's mostly because it's just jammed full of words about her eminent husband, Odysseus.
Yeah, she realizes that her entire existence pretty much was defined by him, by his absence, by his stories, and by the lies, mostly lies that surrounded him. And she finally admits what she must have always suspected. Odysseus was a plausible liar. He was a trickster, a man who specialized in getting away with it and making fools of other people.
And I think this is where she lets herself feel this incredible retrospective anger. She realizes she was turned into an edifying legend, a symbol, a mythological stick, as she puts it, used to beat other women with for her supposed constancy. She was this unattainable standard of purity.
And that seems to be her deepest resentment. She wants to scream from the grave, don't follow my example, don't be me. But even in death, her voice is restricted. She says that when she tries to yell a warning, she only sounds like an owl. The owl, the symbol of Athene, the very goddess who supported her husband's treacherous ways.
That is a bitter irony, isn't it? Her voice of warning is just the sound of his biggest divine supporter. And she acknowledges the fundamental flaw in their marriage. She says she always knew he was famous for being tricky, for being cunning and deceptive. But
But she never thought he would play his tricks and try out his lies on her.
Exactly. She had idealized their partnership somehow. And she realizes now that the only way to get a happy ending in that world was by, you know, keeping the right doors locked and going to sleep during the rampages. She had to ignore things, suppress what she knew, just to maintain that illusion of the perfect wife.
So now, her new job in the underworld is storytelling, what she calls a low art. It's the job of people who don't matter. Old women, strolling beggars, blind singers, maidservants, children. But now that she's dead and public opinion means nothing, she embraces it. She can finally take control of the narrative that history stole from her.
And that is immediately interrupted by the most potent force in the entire book.
The chorus of the maids. Yeah, they are not background noise. They are this scathing, rhythmic, constant counterpoint to every single thing Penelope tries to say to justify herself.
Their entrance is so sharp, so visceral. Their first lament is styled as a rope-jumping rhyme, which has this eerie, childish innocence to it. But the words are just pure, raw grievance.
They chant, "We are the maids, the ones you killed, the ones you failed," and they repeat over and over, "It was not fair." They force you, the listener, to confront the physical horror of their execution. They highlight the grotesque details, saying they danced in air and their bare feet twitched. Atwood is giving a voice and a body to that one unspeakable line in Homer.
And what I found so effective is that they don't just focus on the hanging. They remind us of the deliberate cruelty that came before it. Before they were killed, they were forced into this act of profound degradation. They had to scrub the bloody floors of the Great Hall. They had to clean up the aftermath of the suitors' slaughter, and many of those suitors were their lovers, or at least their paramours.
They were on their knees in water and blood, scrubbing the floors, the chairs, the doors, while Odysseus and Telemachus stood over them, watching. The maids interpret that whole sequence, the scrubbing, the watching, the hanging, as an act of cruel pleasure. They accuse Odysseus directly. You lift our fear, it gave you pleasure. It establishes them, right from the start, as these eternal, clear-eyed accusers who will never ever let him forget.
That sets a very dark tone for this deep dive, but we have to move on. Because to really get Penelope's strategic mind, her capacity for betrayal, you have to go back to her origins. So let's shift to part 2. Penelope's identity and the politics of marriage, starting with that troubled childhood.
Right. Penelope wasn't just a mortal princess. She was a semi-divine birth daughter of King Icarius of Sparta and a naiad, a water nymph. And as she notes, being connected to the divine never hurts immediately, but it certainly didn't protect her from her own family.
In fact, it's why she nearly died. When she was very young, her own father ordered her to be thrown into the sea. This is such a crucial piece of her character, and Penelope, looking back from Hades, suspects it was all because Icarius misheard an oracle.
A classic trope in mythology, right? The misheard prophecy. Penelope's theory is that Icarius thought she was fated to weave his shroud, which would cause his death. But in reality, it was her future father-in-law, Laertes, whose shroud she'd become famous for. But whatever the reason, the message to young Penelope was clear. Her father was a danger to her.
And the rescue itself is so mundane. It's not heroic at all. Because she's the daughter of a naiad, water is her element. She doesn't drown. She gets rescued not by a god or a prince, but by a flock of purple-striped ducks that just tow her ashore.
And that's how she gets her lifelong nickname, Duck. This nickname, this association with the ordinary instead of the majestic, it really defines her. She's rescued by ducks, not eagles.
So what's the psychological fallout from all this?
Mm-hmm.
Her father, realizing his mistake, swings to the other extreme, becoming overly affectionate. But Penelope develops this calm facade and a deep, deep reserve. She learns early on that she has to be self-sufficient because, having been nearly killed by her own family, she could hardly count on family support. She learns that everyone has an angle, and she has to be the sharpest one in the room to survive.
And that narrative of sort of privileged cynicism is so powerfully contrasted by what the maids sing about next. They call it Kitty Mornin'. It's the counter-narrative to Penelope's anxieties about prophecies and royal politics.
Yeah, while Penelope was worrying about which prophecy was going to get her killed, the maids were dealing with immediate, real threats. They were born to poor parents, slave parents, peasant parents, and serf parents. Parents who sold us, parents from whom we were stolen. Their lives were not their own from day one.
Their reality was just ceaseless, grinding drudgery. They were kicked awake if they overslept. They were the dirty girls whose specialty was dirt. They were at the absolute bottom of the hierarchy where basic human rights just didn't exist.
And Atwood forces us to confront the heartbreaking truth of the sexual exploitation that was just part of their position. If an owner or a nobleman wanted them, they couldn't refuse. And their lives were actually worse if they were pretty children, because their value was immediately seen and well exploited.
They lived by snatching these tiny moments of agency for themselves. A filched bit of food, a shared laugh in the attics, whispering secrets. They knew their bodies had no political value, unlike a princess like Penelope, whose body was a piece of geopolitical currency.
Which brings us directly to the arranged marriage contest. Penelope sees her own marriage as a cold, calculated transaction. Marriages, she explains, were for important people. They were about inheritances, alliances, and sometimes, avenging old wrongs.
The rules of the game were simple and brutal. The man who won the physical contest, in this case a foot race, got the woman. And he also got the wedding loot, which, and this is key, traditionally stayed with the bride's family. So these men were competing for wealth and for the strategic alliance of marrying into the Spartan royal family.
And Penelope, the prize in all this, she saw herself very clearly. She was clever, sure, but not overly beautiful. She was just Penelope the duck.
Yeah.
She felt shy and miserable because she knew the men were only after the pile of glittering junk, not her.
And the maids, who were basically the palace intelligence network, they had all the gossip that confirmed this. They openly dismissed Odysseus as a serious candidate. To them, he was this guy with rustic clothes and the manners of a small-town big shot.
They saw his famous cunning as just being too clever for his own good, and they were obsessed with his short legs. It was clearly a running joke in the court. They even joked that he was a cheat and a thief, just like his grandfather, Autolycus, who was a known friend of Hermes, the god of thieves.
The social dynamic there is just fascinating. Even as slaves, the maids had the freedom to openly mock a minor prince's appearance and reputation. But that comfort gets shattered the second Helen walks in.
Of course. Helen is intolerably beautiful, and she just cuts through the room with this single cruel comment aimed at both Penelope and Odysseus. She jokes that Odysseus would suit Penelope because they both had such short legs. It confirms all of Penelope's worst anxieties and just shows Helen's vanity and how much she enjoys making others feel small.
And the maids gossip about Odysseus being a cheat. Turns out it was true. He won the race by cheating. Uncle Tyndareus, Helen's father, basically fixed it. He drugged the other contestants' wine and gave Odysseus a stimulating potion. It was a political fix, plain and simple.
And this fix leads to two competing theories about the marriage. The official rumor was that Tyndareus gave Penelope to Odysseus as payment for coming up with the oath that bound all of Helen's suitors, a political favor for a political asset.
But Penelope, ever the cynic, has her own theory. She thinks Tyndareus just wanted her and any sons she might have out of Sparta completely. Why? To stop her father, Icarius, from using her in a future power grab. In either story, Penelope is just a pawn on the board.
So she's handed over, in her words, like a package of meat in a wrapping of gold. She's so nervous on her wedding day she can't even eat. But this is the moment where Odysseus shows her his strategic side, the side that will, for a time, bind them together in this cynical partnership.
He's very calculating. He doesn't get drunk. He knows a man living by his wits has to keep them sharp. And when it comes time for the traditional performative mock rape ritual on their wedding night, he gets her to fake her screams to satisfy the people listening outside.
It's the ultimate first move in their twisted relationship, isn't it? He immediately draws her into a little conspiracy that's based on shared deceit. It creates this us-against-the-world feeling, but it's all rooted in artifice.
And he builds on that by telling her the story of the long scar on his thigh, the one he got from a boar hunt with his grandfather, Autolycus. It's the famous story from Homer that proves his identity later.
But Penelope's interpretation is just perfectly cynical. She immediately suspects the whole thing was a setup. She thinks Autolycus tried to have Odysseus killed to get out of paying the gifts he owed him.
And that suspicion is so important because it cements their bond. They were both nearly destroyed by their own family members. They both understood that betrayal from within your own family was the most common danger in their world.
And finally, as they leave Sparta, that famous scene where her father chases their chariot, begging her to stay. Penelope says it happened, but her motivation is totally revised. She pulled her veil down, not out of modesty or sadness, but as she says from Hades, to hide the fact that I was laughing at her father's hypocrisy. She was finally free.
That laugh seals her transition to Ithaca, which, ironically, is no safe haven. And that brings us to part 3. The 20 years of waiting and the trap. Ithaca was a huge shock after Sparta. It was windy, rainy, cold, all rocks and goats. The palace was okay, but it wasn't grand. It was a place where, austerity breeds resentment.
And that resentment was waiting for her inside the palace. The household dynamics were impossibly difficult for a young queen arriving with a reputation for just being clever.
Her mother-in-law, Anticlea, was the first problem. She was circumspect, passive-aggressive, prune-mouthed, always offering this quiet disapproval with comments like, "You don't look well." It's that relentless, low-grade hostility that just crushes your soul.
But the real controlling force was Euryclea, the nurse. She was fiercely loyal to Odysseus, whom she'd raised, and totally possessive of her role in the household. She actively blocked Penelope from taking on her wifely duties, telling her, "You're barely more than a child yourself."
She literally snatched the baby Telemachus away from Penelope, arguing that a young mother like her was unfit. This left Penelope completely isolated, stripped of her role as both wife and mother in her own home. So she retreats into weeping and eventually obsessive weaving.
It's no wonder she felt so alone. But Odysseus, ever the strategist, did share one vital secret with her, maybe to try and counter Euryclea's power: the olive tree bedpost. This bedpost was rooted in the ground, part of the foundation of the house, and it formed one corner of their bed. Only Odysseus, Penelope, and her now dead maid Actorus knew about it.
And this is where that cynical partnership shows its dark side. He joked, or maybe it was a threat, that if she ever betrayed him, he'd know, and he would chop me into little pieces, or hang me from the roof beam.
That joke is absolutely terrifying in retrospect, isn't it? It's this incredibly unsettling foreshadowing of the final violence. It establishes the penalty for disloyalty right at the start of their marriage.
And that threat just hangs in the air for 20 years. But first, disaster strikes when Telemachus is only one. Helen, of course, runs off with Paris. They steal a bunch of plunder, and her former husband Menelaus and his brother Agamemnon are enraged. The war machine starts turning.
And the irony is just devastating. Odysseus is in despair because he's bound by the very oath he devised for Helen's suitors. Every man had to defend the winner's rights. The great strategist, trapped by his own cleverness.
He tries to get out of it, of course. He fakes madness, plowing a field with an ox and a donkey, sowing salt instead of seeds. But the shrewd Palamedes exposes him by putting the baby Telemachus right in front of the plow. The father's instinct wins out. Odysseus has to turn aside, and he's forced to go to Troy.
Penelope notes that he was also secretly flattered by it all. An oracle had said Troy couldn't fall without him. That's an ego boost no man like Odysseus could ever resist. So he leaves for his 20 years of adventure, and he leaves Penelope to manage the quiet tyranny of Ithaca.
For almost a decade, she waits, relatively undisturbed. But when hope for his return finally starts to fade, the vultures arrive. The suitors only start showing up after he's been gone for 9 or 10 years. They descend on the palace like vultures when they spot a dead cow, certain the hero is dead.
And their presence is basically economic warfare. They call themselves guests, but they're butchering Odysseus' livestock every day, feasting, drinking his wine, and casually pinching the maids. They were eating the kingdom from the inside out.
And their motives are confirmed by the suitor Antinous, who speaks from Hades in Atwood's version. It wasn't love for the now 35-year-old Penelope. It was purely for the treasure trove in the kingdom. Penelope knew their plan was to make her queen for a little while and then have her die first, perhaps with a little help since she was so much older than them.
The danger was immediate. And the maids who were serving the suitors at these feasts, they would hear all the crude jokes and report them back to Penelope. Things like, "Just imagine she's Helen." You can feel the intense psychological pressure she was under.
But the gossip wasn't just a one-way street. Penelope, ever the sharp observer, wonders if the maids maybe invented some of the gossip to tease her, or to see how she'd react. It shows she was aware that the maids were also players in the palace's game of information control.
And this idea that information is power is what leads directly to the famous shroud strategy. This is the core of her alleged constancy, and tragically, the origin of the maid's destruction. She was desperate. She had to postpone marriage before her entire inheritance was gobbled up.
So she sets up this elaborate trick, weaving a costly shroud for her father-in-law, Laertes. She promises she'll choose a husband as soon as it's finished. The simple version is that she secretly unraveled it every night for 3 years. But that task, undoing all that detailed weaving, it was exhausting, and it required absolute secrecy.
Which is where she turns to the maids. She chooses 12 of her youngest, most trusted, and loveliest maids to help her pick away the threads behind locked doors. This wasn't a mistress-servant dynamic, it was a conspiracy.
Penelope even admits that in the intimacy of those locked rooms, they shared riddles, jokes, treats. They acted almost like sisters. This was the only genuine human connection Penelope had in Ithaca, and it softened her rigid, defensive shell.
But then came the catastrophic decision, what Penelope later calls the fatal orders, her grave mistake. The unraveling trick could only buy so much time. She needed intelligence. So she instructs those 12 girls to hang around the suitors, to spy on them, and most dangerously, to use their enticing arts to get information.
This order puts the girls in an impossible position. In that culture, providing lively nighttime entertainment could be part of a host's hospitality. But, as Penelope notes, it was most irregular for the servants to be used in this way without the permission of the master of the house.
And since the master was gone, the suitors just helped themselves. These young, vulnerable women, some of them barely children, were exposed to inevitable rape and seduction, all under the guise of espionage. Penelope sacrificed their physical safety for her political security.
And, of course, the system broke down. The betrayal is described as just careless. One of the 12 maids let slip the secret of the unraveling. The suitors, now knowing the trick, caught Penelope in the act and forced her to finish the weaving. Her 3-year reprieve was over, and the danger was immediate.
Penelope, looking back from the underworld, tries to rationalize their actions. She says she had told them to pretend to be in love with the suitors, to say rude things about her and Telemachus to maintain their cover. Melantho of the pretty cheeks was especially good at this.
She even says she forgave them, noting that some of them probably did genuinely fall in love with the men who had used them. But the key point is that they were compromised. To the rest of the household, especially to Euryclea, they weren't clever spies. They were notorious whores collaborating with the enemy.
This tragic mess of necessity, deception, and vulnerability brings us to the climax in Part 4. The return, the trial, and the tragedy of the maids.
Odysseus comes back not as a king in glory, but as a dirty, smelly old beggar, the perfect disguise for a master of deceit. And he immediately proves he's still a brute by breaking the neck of a rival beggar who challenges him. It's a moment of pure, savage Odysseus.
And Penelope, watching this beggar from the shadows, she knows. She recognizes him immediately. She sees the barrel chest and those short legs, but she says nothing. She knows it was an imprudence to step between a man and the reflection of his own cleverness. Odysseus had a script to follow, a heroic role to play, and she was smart enough not to get in the way.
She wasn't just being passive. She was actively managing the situation. She's the one who sets the stage for the bow test, bringing out that huge ancient bow that only Odysseus could string and shoot through 12 axe handles.
And she's very clear on this point. She claims this was not a coincidence. It was deliberate, calculated planning on her part. She knew only he could do it, which would prove his identity and, in her mind, validate her own long wait. She'd held out for the one true hero.
And while she's still feigning ignorance, she tells the beggar a dream she had. An eagle, representing Odysseus, kills her 20 white geese, representing the suitors. And the beggar, Odysseus in disguise, eagerly agrees with her interpretation.
But the haunting part is Penelope's realization later, in Hades. The geese, the beautiful, pure creatures in her dream. They weren't the suitors. They weren't the male predators. They were her 12 maids, her snow-white geese, the innocent ally she was about to sacrifice.
That dream, which she shares right before the slaughter, it reveals that on some subconscious level, Penelope knew she was sacrificing her own people, the women she called sisters, to get her husband and her old life back.
She keeps playing this strategic game right up to the end. She sets a little booby trap for Euryclea, asking her to wash the beggar's feet, knowing full well the nurse would find that famous scar. Penelope admits she had to hide her laughter when Euryclea shrieked and almost gave the whole plot away.
This whole sequence, the feigned ignorance, the bow, the dream, the scar, it shows Penelope operating as Odysseus's equal in strategy. They are two master liars dancing around the truth, orchestrating this final bloody scene together.
But before the slaughter, Penelope takes a moment in her monologue to fiercely address the slanderous gossip that has followed her for centuries. The rumors that she slept with Amphinomus, the nicest suitor, or even all of them, and gave birth to the great god Pan.
Her defense is sharp and it's purely political. She says she only led them on to get expensive gifts from them, gold, jewelry, fine fabrics. It was, she says, a matter of policy to preserve the kingdom's wealth. And she claims Odysseus, as the beggar, saw this and approved.
She also insists that the reason Odysseus didn't reveal himself to her right away wasn't because he distrusted her. He trusted her because they were partners in cynicism. He was just afraid her tears of joy would give away his disguise too early.
Then the slaughter of the suitors begins, and Penelope is forcibly removed from the scene. She suspects Euryclea drugged her drink to keep her locked away in her rooms. This enforced absence allows the tragedy of the maids to unfold, shielding Penelope from having to watch it, but not from the ultimate guilt.
After the massacre, Odysseus, still focused on purification and order, tells Euryclea to point out the disloyal maids.
And Euryclea, who is probably anticipating what Odysseus wants to hear and is certainly eager to please her returned master, she selects just 12. The impertinent ones, she calls them, Melantho and her cronies, whom she immediately slanders as notorious whores.
And this is the moment Penelope realizes the horrific truth. The maids who were chosen to be hanged were the ones who'd been raped, the youngest, the most beautiful, my eyes and ears, my helpers, my snow-white geese.
Penelope had never told Euryclea the details of her spying scheme, so Euryclea, who is blinded by her own resentment and her rigid morality, only saw the girls who were consorting with the enemy. Penelope's strategic mistake, her failure to manage her own household's information stream, proved fatal for her most vulnerable allies.
And the hanging itself is distinguished by Telemachus's particular cruelty. Odysseus had originally ordered him to use swords to chop them to pieces, which would have been a typical warrior's death. But Telemachus, who is desperate to prove his manhood to his formidable father, decides to hang them all in a single row from a ship's cable instead. He elevates the brutality from a bloody mess to this chilling, ritualistic display.
Penelope even lingers on a more sinister explanation for Euryclea's actions. What if it wasn't just a misunderstanding? What if the nurse knew about Penelope's arrangement with the maids, the special treatment, the shared secrets, and she singled them out for murder out of pure resentment and a desire to get back her primary trusted position with Odysseus?
That makes Euryclea a co-conspirator. The maids' deaths were useful to Odysseus for cleansing the palace, useful to Telemachus for asserting his manhood, and deeply useful to Euryclea for reestablishing her domestic power over the queen.
And this is where Atwood takes the whole discussion beyond simple domestic cruelty and into deep mythological critique. It's the anthropological reinterpretation offered by the maids themselves. The maids, as a chorus, demand that we look past the sordid reality of their death to see the underlying ritualistic meaning. They suggest they represent an ancient cultural clash.
To start with the number 12. This number, they point out, is so potent. 12 apostles, 12 months of the year, and most importantly, the 12 moon maidens, the companions of Artemis, the virginal but deadly goddess of the moon.
Their theory is just astonishing. They propose they were ritual sacrifices, not just victims of a purge. They argue that their orgiastic fertility rite behavior with the suitors was followed by a purification, which they enacted by scrubbing the blood of the dead men, and then they willingly sacrificed themselves to reenact the dark of the moon phase.
So they're essentially arguing their deaths were a necessary cultural sacrifice. They want to be credited with the same selflessness as someone like Iphigenia, who was sacrificed by her father for the success of the Trojan War. They are claiming a higher dignity for their brutal end.
Which connects directly to this major thread in mythological scholarship, the overthrow of ancient matriarchal systems. The maids argue that their fate represents the brutal overthrow of a matrilineal moon cult, the one associated with the Great Mother and Artemis, by these usurping patriarchal father-god-worshipping barbarians led by Odysseus. The hero's homecoming is reframed as a political and religious purge.
Okay, let's define one of those concepts for our listeners. They talk about the 12 axes from the bow test. These axes were significantly not used as weapons in the slaughter. They think they were possibly the ritual double-bladed laborer's axes.
Yes, the labrys is a huge symbol in archaeology, historically linked to the Minoan Great Mother cult. In some theories, these axes were used to ceremonially lop off the head of the year king after his term was up. It was a fertility ritual that demanded sacrifice from the male leader to ensure regeneration.
The symbolism then becomes terrifyingly clear, doesn't it? Odysseus, the usurping strongman, uses the curved bow of Artemis the moon goddess to shoot an arrow through her own ritual laborer's axes, basically demonstrating his power over her cult and desecrating her instruments.
And since Odysseus, driven by a greedy desire for power and long life, refused to be the sacrificial year king, he had to find substitutes for the required rituals, the hanging and the castration, to satisfy the old ways.
And the maids were the substitutes. The hanging still took place, but it was the 12 moon maidens who swung in his place, fulfilling the cultural demand for sacrifice. The castration, the final brutal act of purifying the palace, also happened, but it was done to the goatherd Melanthius, the disloyal male servant, not to the hero Odysseus.
This anthropological argument lets Atwood do something profound. The maids end their lecture with this chilling, highly educated plea. They say, don't think of us as real girls with real pain and real injustice, because that might be too upsetting. Just discard the sordid part. Consider us pure symbol. We're no more real than money.
But of course, by demanding we objectify them as symbols, they force us to recognize their brutalized humanity and the painful reality of what happened to them. It's an incredibly sophisticated move.
It absolutely is. It turns their execution from a footnote of violence into a pivotal moment of mythological transition, the moment patriarchy officially crushes the last remnants of the old Earth cult.
Now we move into our final section, Part 5, the eternal aftermath. After all the bloodshed, Penelope finally comes downstairs. She says she acted with a calculated resistance, appearing flinty-hearted when she meets the cleaned-up Odysseus.
And this wasn't because she was unconvinced he was real. It was because she had to manage his ego and his paranoia. She had to reassure him she hadn't been unfaithful and that she wasn't easily fooled. Their relationship, even after 20 years, is still defined by suspicion and strategy.
The final confirmation comes with the famous bedpost test. Penelope orders Euryclea to move their bed, which she knows is impossible because it's rooted to the ground. Odysseus immediately loses his temper, furious that someone might have dared to cut through his cherished olive tree bedpost, the symbol of their unmoving marriage.
He proves this identity not with an act of love, but with an outburst of possessive rage. Penelope notes that this confirmed it was him far more effectively than any scar could have. He was the same volatile, possessive man who had threatened to hang her from the roof beam 20 years before.
And once they're reunited, they immediately fall back into their old habit of storytelling. They recount their noble adventures, monsters and goddesses on his side, shroud tricks and deceitful encouragements on hers.
Penelope says they both admitted to being proficient and shameless liars, masters of deceit. Yet even though they both knew the other was spinning a tale, they claimed to believe each other. And that is the core of their relationship. A shared, necessary willingness to accept the strategic lie for the sake of the partnership.
But the happy ending is very brief. Odysseus leaves almost immediately on a second journey. He says he has to purify himself by carrying an oar inland until someone mistakes it for a winnowing fan, just as the spirit of Tiresias told him to do in the underworld.
He claims this journey is to rinse the suitor's blood from him and to pacify the god Poseidon. But Penelope, with her typical skepticism, calls it a likely story. We're left to wonder if the real reason he leaves is because he can't settle down, or maybe he's just terrified of the consequences of his own violence.
And that fear of consequences is personified by the maids. In Hades, Penelope remains. She refuses to drink from the waters of forgetfulness. She keeps her memory and observes that the world stays dangerous, and human nature is as tawdry as ever.
Her vain cousin Helen is also there, still on her endless excursions. She continues her vanity even in death, taking body-bearing baths to perk up the spirits of the dead men who died for her. Penelope says Helen's been reincarnated and caused empires to fall over and over, never facing any consequences.
But Odysseus, he's trapped in a cyclical hell that's way more painful than Helen's. He keeps returning to Hades, weeping, claiming Penelope is the only one he ever wanted. They snack on asphodel, they tell the old stories, and just as Penelope starts to believe him again, he sees the maids.
And the sight of his 12 victims drives him to drink from the river Lethe, the waters of forgetfulness, again and again. He tries to wash away his guilt, but he's just stuck in a loop.
He takes on endless new lives, always trying to escape the ghosts. Penelope lists them. A French general, a Mongolian invader, a tycoon, a film star, and it always ends badly for him. Suicide, assassination, an accident. He's desperate to be anyone else, anywhere else, just to escape.
Because the maids are the force that tears them apart. They are relentless. They are 12 accusations that follow him everywhere, in every life and afterlife, sticking to him like a shadow. They accuse him of an honor killing and demand a justice that reincarnation can't erase.
Their final collective word is the envoy, their formal send-off. They recap their lack of identity in life. We had no voice, we had no name, we had no choice. But in the afterlife, they have found their purpose. They are here, and they will follow the hero eternally.
And in the very last, deeply symbolic move of the book, the maids sprout feathers and fly away as owls, calling out, "To wit, to woo!" And this transformation is the final, inescapable judgment on the wily hero.
This is such a critical moment of mythological inversion. The wise, protective owl is traditionally the symbol of Athene, Odysseus' patron goddess. the one who supported his deceit and ensured his victory.
But here, Atwood completely co-opts that image. The owl's cry, the maid's collective haunting voice. It's not wisdom or guidance, it is pure accusation. She takes the symbol of patriarchal protection and turns it into the eternal voice of his victims. And the question the story leaves us with is, does Penelope truly escape her guilt for sacrificing those girls? Or is the sound of the owl following her too?
The ultimate provocation Atwood leaves us with is this. The traditional, heroic story of Odysseus demands that his glory comes first. But the cost of that glory was the brutal silencing and murder of 12 vulnerable young women. If that's the price of a hero's legend, is it a glory worth having? It's a thought that follows Odysseus and should follow us long after this deep dive is done.
A question for eternal reflection, absolutely. What does the history we choose to celebrate say about the victims we choose to forget?
Exactly. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the Penelopiad.